the world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
This morning I told my mama to watch her back because they out to get us. They're planning.
As we all adjust to life amid the coronavirus, an epidemic of Asian hate crimes are on the rise. Social media groups, elected officials, and now the FBI are recognizing the increase in hate crimes and are fighting back against the xenophobia. As this biological threat looms over us, my feeds are becoming infected with hate. The xenophobia town hall I was just in was Zoom-bombed by hate speech.
This is part of that much larger history of racism. We are part of that story too.
After all these years, after all the we think progress that we've made through the decades, where did it go? Where did it go?
The FBI says to expect a surge in hate crimes. A family in Texas who are refugees from Burma, they were attacked for being perceived as Chinese, and the assailant said the coronavirus happens because of you and slashed them in the head. People are coughing at Asians and spitting at Asians all over the place pretty regularly. 60% are other Asians of different ethnicities who are being attacked. Women are 3 times more likely to be harassed. People have been boycotting Asian businesses. And so you're afraid that how will we survive economically? And so these stressors, I think, could be making Asian Americans more anxious, more depressed, more isolated. And so that's a heavy consequence on the community.
It's particularly helpful to place what we're experiencing today within that larger historical context so that Asian Americans, especially young Asian Americans, understand this has very little to do with them. You know, they did nothing wrong. It has a long history that predated us, but there's also a really long history of Asian Americans responding to racism.
Good evening, and welcome to Ask a Reporter, our live meetup series where Los Angeles Times journalists discuss the news and answer your questions about current events, behind-the-scenes decision-making, and the stories that we cover. I'm Teresa Watanabe, and I cover education for the Times. And tonight we'll be discussing the escalation of anti-Asian violence and hate crimes. I'll be talking with author, actor, and activist George Takei, along with 2 of my newsroom colleagues, Ann Do and Ada Tseng. I'd like to start off the discussion by introducing our first guest, George Takei, who really needs no introduction. He's known to millions as Mr. Sulu for his role in the original Star Trek series. He's also the author of They Called Us Enemy, a 2019 graphic novel about his family's experiences in World War II detention camps. Welcome, George.
Good to be joining you, and thank you for the invitation to do this show.
Well, George, we haven't seen each other since our last event together at the L.A. Times Book Club, and it's really great to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
A lot of time has passed, and a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since that L.A. Times event at the Montalban Theater.
Yeah. Well, California has a really long history of anti-Asian violence, including the horrific Chinese massacre of 1861. And George, you are no stranger to anti-Asian hate, having been literally raised in racism as a 5-year-old boy, forced from your Los Angeles home with your family into incarceration camps with other Japanese Americans in both Tule Lake and in Arkansas. Can you tell us what that was like?
Well, I was, as you say, 5 years old then. And one morning, my father came rushing into our bedroom that I shared with my brother, a year younger, Henry. And he dressed us quickly and told us to wait in the living room while our parents did some last-minute packing back in the bedroom with our baby sister in the crib there. So my brother and I were just gazing out the neighborhood when we saw 2 soldiers suddenly marching up our driveway. They carried rifles with shiny bayonets on them. They stomped up the front porch and with their fists began pounding on the door. It was a terrifying sound. We felt like the whole house was trembling. My father came out and answered the door, and literally at gunpoint and bayonet point, we were ordered out of our home. My father got about 5 or 10 minutes from them and went back and came out with the 2 heavy suitcases, and we followed him out down the steps of the porch, stood on the driveway waiting for our mother to come out. And when she finally came out, escorted by one of the soldiers, she had our baby sister in one arm, a huge duffel bag in the other, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. That horrible, terrifying morning is seared into my memory. I'll never be able to forget that. We were taken from our home to Santa Anita Racetrack and assigned a horse stall that was still pungent with the stench of horse manure. And that was to be our home for about 4 or 5 months while the camps were being built. And so from a 2-bedroom home on Garnet Street to a smelly horse stall where my baby sister immediately got sick, and later I got sick as well. But when the camps were built, we were loaded onto trains with soldiers at both ends of each car and taken 2/3 of the way across the country. My mother kept chanting 3 days and 2 nights, 3 days and 2 nights, and we were taken to the swamps of Arkansas. I remember the barbed wire fence and the sentry towers. At night when we made the night run to the latrine, searchlights followed us. My mother considered it a humiliating invasion with those lights. But to 5-year-old me, I thought it was nice that they lit the way for me to pee. 2 parallel experiences, same event, but 2 different experiences. And I wanted to share that innocent child's memories in They Called Us Enemy, but at the same time, tell the larger story of my parents, which my parents shared with me as I was growing up, which so many Japanese American parents of my parents' generation did not do. My father did share it with me. So I got an understanding, both from the child's perspective as well as a teenage understanding from my father. And later, I did a great deal of research on my own.
Well, Japanese Americans faced a lot of hate when they returned to the West Coast after the camps. And that wasn't the end of the anti-Asian hate that you've experienced. What are other experiences that you have had with this as an actor and activist?
Well, the worst part for us kids, by that time I was 8, my brother was 7, our baby sister was a toddler. The worst part was being released from camp, because with in imprisonment, at least there was regimentation and order, and the ritual of 3 meals a day at the mess hall. Our first hatred was still very strong, and they had taken everything from us. We were penniless. When they let us out, they gave us each a one-way ticket to anywhere in the United States that we wanted to go to, and $25. We were to start life anew, a 5-member family, with nothing, with all the intense hostility still at us. The only place we could find a home was on Skid Row. And that, to us kids, was the most terrifying part of the entire 4-year imprisonment. It was sheer chaos all the time. Sirens going, people fighting, shrieking, and the stench of human waste everywhere, on the sidewalk, in the hallways, everywhere. And the derelicts staggering around or leaning on a wall or sprawled on the sidewalk and fighting with each other women pulling each other's hair and falling down. And we had one occasion when the derelict barfed, and my baby sister said, "Mama, let's go back home." For her, home was behind barbed wire fences. That's all she knew all her life.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of similarities and differences do you see between what happened 80 years ago and the current surge of anti-Asian hate?
Well, the anti-Asian hate now was exactly what, in fact, it was even more intense. Bricks were thrown through windows of some people's homes. Shopkeepers had bricks thrown through their homes, and our homes were graffitied, cars were graffitied. It was horrible, but there's a dramatic difference between then and now. Today, we have leadership from our leaders. That powerful speech that President Biden made last week saying this Asian hate violence is un-American. It's got to stop. We will not tolerate it anymore. But 80 years ago, the government too was swept up by that hysteria. The so-called leaders were being led by the mass hysteria. We had an attorney general here who actually was looking at the governor's seat. He wanted to run for that, and he needed an issue. And he made an amazing statement for an attorney general. He said, "We have no reports of sabotage or spying or fifth column activities by Japanese Americans." And that is ominous because the Japanese are inscrutable. You can't tell what they're thinking. So he said, as a preventative, it would be prudent to lock them up before they do anything. Lock them up before they do anything. So for this top attorney of California, the absence of evidence was the evidence. And the same mentality, seeing us as the enemy, went to the presidency of the United States. President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19th signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, approximately 120,000 of us, to be rounded up with no charges because we hadn't done anything, with no trial, and that's part of our justice system. The central pillar of our justice system is due process. When you're arrested, you have a right to know what the charges are and then challenge them in a court of law. That disappeared. So back then, the government was against us as well as the media. And so we're very grateful that now we have a true leader in the presidency of the United States and the media truthfully reporting the facts. We had not done anything wrong, but that was not known by the masses at that time because the press was part of the mass.
Well, let's talk about what's happening now. And I would love to bring in our two other guests, Ann Doe and Ada Tseng. Ann is a reporter in our Metro section covering Asian American communities. And Ada is an editor with our utility journalism team and also the co-host of a podcast, Saturday School, about Asian American pop culture history. Thank you so much for joining us, Ann and Ada.
Thank you, Teresa.
And also to our audience for your grace of presence here tonight.
Well, Ann, you have been on the front lines of this coverage long before the horrific Atlanta shootings the other week. You have been on this story literally from the moment the surge really started with the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you take us into your reporting and share some of the most powerful moments that you have experienced on this story?
Yeah, my first story on anti-Asian racism landed in the summer of 2020. And beyond the sensational headlines and the major hate crimes, what I've noticed is how ordinary lives and the interaction of people on a daily basis have been affected, especially for our elderly, the ones the single demographic that is most tied to a routine and routines that have been stolen from them. What they depend on, regular things like walking their dogs, going to the salon to dye their hair, stopping at a grocery store for fresh produce, even practicing Tai Chi every morning. You know, at times they feel like they're being watched or that they could be targeted at any moment. So they've chosen to stay home, isolated. In Los Angeles, two Thai sisters who are grandmothers told me that they no longer step out of their house or take the bus except for a few medical appointments each year. In San Francisco, a Chinese woman pulling one of those plastic grocery carts filled with tropical fruit and soybean milk, according to her daughter, got mugged for less than $30. And in Oakland, I hung out with two ex-convicts and their buddies who formed a group called Asians with Attitudes to guard seniors in Chinatown, an epicenter of hate. Their chaperone services are being expanded to Southern California, where I'll be shadowing them soon. You know, in Orange County, I spoke to a tutor who is starting to buy pepper spray in bulk for his family around Little Saigon. And in Santa Ana area, you know, people living near Latino downtown neighborhoods are teaming up for a buddy system. Whenever they leave home, there's always someone with them. People do not feel as if they can venture out alone. And what's fascinating is that for the first time in their lives, they're willing to talk about it. A lot of these people are monolingual, and I am very grateful that they're coming forward to share their experiences.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, Asian Americans that I know never thought they had to worry about their safety, including members of my own third generation, fourth generation family, are going out and buying pepper spray because you just don't know what will happen.
What people said is what George had alluded to. Anti-Asian racism has always existed, but the pandemic has really lifted the lid on this crisis.
You know, violence against Asians has been throughout American history. It is a part of American history. Teresa, I think you made reference to the lynching of 18 Chinese men back in 1871, and the Vincent Chin case, where the impact of Japanese automobiles on the American market created a lot of hardship on the part of auto workers in Detroit. And so there was a frustration there. And one night, Vincent Chin, a Chinese American, went in to celebrate his bachelor party in a bar. And these two unemployed auto workers thought he was Japanese because we look alike, and they started up a exchange of words with him. And so Vincent left the bar. Those two unemployed auto workers followed him out with a baseball bat in hand, and they beat him to death. When the killers were dragged into court, the judge said he understood the pain of unemployed auto workers. Vincent Chin's mother was there in the courtroom, and he said he understood the pain of the auto workers, and gave them a slap on the hand, a $3,000 fine, and probation. And so that galvanized the Asian American community from coast to coast, West Coast to the East Coast. I flew from Los Angeles to Detroit to participate in the rally there. We are still seen as alike, and we bear the same guilt for whatever they perceive as blamable on us. So it's been, and whenever, you know, the hate has been there throughout on a slow simmer. But whenever there are events like that, the hate surges up. And we're going through another one like that right now.
Well, in the last week or so, the Los Angeles Times has actually invited people to share their experiences with anti-Asian hate. And we've heard so many heart-wrenching stories, everything from, just verbal harassment to physical assaults. Ada has been tracking this. Ada, can you share some of the stories that we've been hearing from our readers?
Yeah, so it was March 18th after the Atlanta spa shootings that we did the call out, and we asked, have you as an Asian American been threatened, intimidated, or attacked? And we'll be sharing some of these quotes throughout the panel, and these can also be found on the L.A. Times, Twitter, and Facebook. This first one is from Jen. It took place May 2020. She was verbally abused walking her dog during the day in a busy intersection from Mountain View. It's in the Bay Area, where I grew up, actually. White people told her to go back to China. She's from Canada. Other white people saw what happened and did nothing. Here's another one from Sil. She talks about how she was waiting for an elevator when a white woman did the chinky eye thing, which is like when you pull your eyelids. I'm sure you guys know what it is. And talked about being scared of coronavirus. And then she, complained to a car full of other people. And then those basically was stuck in an elevator with a bunch of white people, who had just harassed her basically. And then here, the third one that we're going to share for now is from Kim. And this takes place in Irvine, close to where I live now, where there's a lot of Asian people. And it's another one that, oh wait, not from Irvine. It is from Irvine, but okay, sorry. And then, but yeah, it's this idea of how hard it is to see this happening to your parents, your parents that come here for a better life. They work so hard and they're so sweet and they're just trying to make a living and they're nice to everybody, and you're watching this happen to them. And I thought this was pretty heartbreaking. At the end, she says, I'm 42 now and I don't think it'll get better in my lifetime, sadly. And now she's scared to go to certain places herself, even in Southern California, where it's so diverse. I don't know what to do.
Wow, that's really heart-wrenching. And we talk about Asian Americans, and I think most people are not aware that Asian Americans are so diverse. Asian Americans come from 50 different ethnic groups with different histories, cultures, religions, and languages. And I'm wondering what you have found in terms of whether there are different communities experiencing the surge in a different way. I know that the Stop AAPI Hate Network found that 42% of hate incidents that they have tracked, 3,800 as of the end of February, are being reported by Chinese Americans. Koreans are second at about 15%. The rest of the communities are double or single digit. So I'm just wondering what you've seen in terms of different communities.
Well, there are generational differences too. My mother was born in Sacramento, and my father was born in Japan, but he was brought to San Francisco as a boy, and he was raised and educated, went to college in San Francisco. So he was Japanese American for our rights and purposes. And there are Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans that are now into their fifth, sixth generation. So there's that generational difference, that diversity that we have. So we are diverse, and yet we look the same to these races. And I have a niece that's just into her first year at Brown University in Rhode Island. And when I heard about the first brutality against young Asian women, I immediately thought about my grandniece. I was worried for her, and I phoned her, and she was all right, and she says that she's all right. But we have this great diversity, but we are all seen as the same.
Well, Ada, and
a lot of the communities, even the minor Asian communities, are starting to come forward because they've seen what's been happening in the dominant Asian communities, and they're encouraged by the reporting and the pushing to report more with especially coverage in ethnic media, complemented by what we're all covering. And this is a huge story for TV. So because of all the multi-platform coverage available now, I see more of a tendency to report month by month.
Well, that's encouraging.
Yeah, so I mean, it's so hard to talk about Asian Americans and then kind of AAPI, especially when you link in Pacific Islanders in there. Because basically it's, you know, it's impossible to encompass all of these experiences. Even if you're putting on an Asian American panel, like I feel like you always feel like you're leaving so many people out. And I mean, like Pacific Islanders especially, it's sort of like, I mean, I don't think they're affected in the same way by this as other ethnicities and Asian Americans. And then the South Asian community is a whole different thing too, because you know they were targets of violence after 9/11, right? And now they're probably not as targeted because that's not who the racists think are Chinese. But I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of feeling where I was like, where was the Stop Asian Hate movement like 20 years ago, like after September 2011? And I feel like that's super valid too. So I think there's like so many different feelings going on. But at the same time, I think when I think about the Asian American community and how even though sometimes it's very siloed and we're so different, we have so many issues and so many different needs, like when something like this happens, that's what brings us all together. That's when we know that we have each other's backs. And I think that kind of, I'm sure all of you on the panel can speak to this too. Like, I think a lot of non-Asians don't understand that the Asian American label came because of this politics, sort of understanding that we come from all of these different countries that really sometimes hate each other. Like I'm from Taiwan, which has a very complicated history with China, but everyone thinks I'm Chinese. Everyone also thinks Koreans and Japanese people, Vietnamese people, anyone who's like lighter skinned Asian is also Chinese, right? But like, you know, when the Asian American movement started, it was like, we need to build political power. And then that's why it banded together, because otherwise it doesn't really make that much sense. But then when there's these moments like this, where if we're like siloed and we don't have the numbers to make any sort of difference, and that's why we come together. And like, actually, I want to share a quote that like the Atlantic published from Kathy Park Hong, who I'm sure a lot of you know, that I think really gets to this. She says, "What I like to say about Asian Americans is that if we think of Asian Americans as less of an identity and more as a coalition, then maybe Asians will feel more comfortable identifying with it, because it allows room for all of our kind of national, economic, and regional distinctions. So it allows us to be distinct, like who we are." You know what I mean? It's not, because I think that's kind of a lot of the thing with all this like Asian American stuff, all this coverage. It's like they think of it as the same. So then when you blame China for the virus, which is very stupid because China was the first victims of the virus, like we are all affected together. So we all have to band together.
So Anne and Ada, oh, I'm sorry, George. I was just going to move on and ask Anne and Ada about what it's been like for them to cover this story as both journalists and Asian American women, especially after the massacres in Atlanta. Anne, why don't you start?
For me, even though we are masked, that doesn't mean that we can't get personal. I find it fascinating to interact with people who often do not have relationships or even experiences with reporters. It might be the first time they're ever approached by a journalist, you know, in Chinatown or in an enclave situation or just on the streets. And I'm talking mainly about the elderly folks, the most vulnerable of the population that have been primarily targeted. So I really try to explain the process of storytelling to them, what I will do with the quotes, how much we might use. And I like to carry a hard copy of the newspaper and show them, this is where your stories will appear. And, we want to honor your experience and be patient with you, but we really want to drill down for the details. I think as a woman, we have to be careful, and I have taken extreme precautions, which I don't always like to reveal publicly, but I feel that, we are armed and we are ready to handle some of the surprises around the different corners waiting for us.
And how about you, Ada? Has it been like for you?
Yeah, so I think this is a story that's really hard to report for anybody. Like, I come from covering Asian Americans, right? Like, I've spent my entire career covering Asian Americans. And even for me, it would have been hard because one, it's in Atlanta. I'm not in Atlanta. I don't know how to speak Korean, right? And what do I know about massage businesses or like sex workers? Not that much. That's not my background, right? So there's all these sort of things, but I think the hardest part of reporting this is like a structural thing in the entire journalism industry. Because if you're Asian American, like my age, like elder millennial, older, like the way that it works to get into the industry is like you either go through mainstream media or you go through ethnic media. So I went through ethnic media, and I think, Anne, you did too, right? And like what happens is if you go through mainstream media as like a person of color, you're there and you have to fight twice as hard to cover the main stories better than any white person there to prove yourself. So then that's the type of person, it's like, that's probably Teresa. Like you probably do not get as much credit as you get for every single thing that you've done at the LA Times. Because, that's just how it is. It's sort of like, it's not anyone's fault, but it's institutional, right? Or you're in ethnic media where you might be like Anne and you make the leap over. You might be like me where you make the leap over much later. But the truth is, most of them don't make the leap over and most of them are pushed out of the industry. So I think for me, it was really so hard to see this because I come from, I used to be a part of Korean Journal, it's a publication in LA that doesn't publish anymore, but they covered Korean Americans, and it's like knowing that like those are the people that mentored me, and those are the people who would have had that background, all of that background that's so hard to build up. All journalists know, like it takes so long to build up your beats, to like get your sources, to understand all the nuance of everything, so that when something pops up quick, like you can do it quick with all the background in your head. It's so hard to do that. And because of these structures, like when something like this happens in Atlanta, the people who are really good at it, like mid-career people who would be really good at it, are not here anymore. So that's a burden, I guess, that's not. Here's the thing, like I'm on the utility team of the LA Times. We do news you can use. Like it's not like if there's a shooting that even as bad as it makes me feel, I'm not the one assigned to it. I can't jump on it. I'm not even qualified to report it, right? But it's like, and people are helping and people are doing the best they can. And I think we did a really great job, like with the resource that we had. Like we had like a great Asian American editor here named Tseng, So it's like we have people here at the LA Times, but it's just so hard. It's just like so many things going on that makes this hard, and you just feel so helpless.
Right. One thing I'm curious about is for Teresa, with your decades-long experience at the Times, how have you viewed our coverage?
I personally think that our coverage has been fantastic. One thing that I want to give a shout out to the LA Times for is that we actually have the largest Asian American newsroom staff of any publication in the nation. And so we have a newsroom full of Asian Americans who have cultural IQ, they've got linguistic abilities. Of course, all of our non-Asian reporters have been, jumping into the story as well. And I just think we are, with California is the epicenter not only of the hate, unfortunately, but also we've got the largest Asian American community. And that is one thing I wanted to ask George about. George, I believe you're the only native California among us. And the Stop AAPI Hate Network actually found in their recent national report that California was the epicenter of hate. And of their 3,800 incidents reported, fully 44.5% of them occurred in California, with New York number 2. Now, we have the largest Asian American community, and we are a progressive blue state. Why, in your opinion, has California always been the epicenter of anti-Asian hate?
Well, because of our numbers, we are the most numerous, and we also have the largest number of ignorant racists in this country. And a good part of the solution is political. And that's why I keep emphasizing that it's important for us to be mindful of our common appearance and work together in concert, because in politics, numbers is where the strength is. And we've got to get particularly reform, police reform, because, for example, the Atlanta situation, the sheriff of Cherokee County keeps insisting that the murderer's problem is sexual addiction, not racism. This man is ignorant, and he knows nothing about law enforcement. In this country, Asian women have become synonymous with, have become the symbol of sexuality. I mean, our popular films and stage plays, The World of Susie Wong, Miss Saigon, is blatantly celebrating Asian women as prostitutes. They become movies. And the American male view of Asian women is what they got after every war in Asia. They roamed the back streets of Tokyo. They roamed the back streets of Saigon. They roamed the back streets of Seoul. Asian women are seen as sexual creatures, but this law enforcement officer of Cherokee County is ignorant of that. He doesn't see that the murderer drove 40 miles, skipping many spas, for that young Asian massage parlor. He selected Asian massage parlors. That sheriff is acting blind and deaf and not seeing the obvious there. He is not qualified to be a law enforcement officer, and we've got to have law reform. All these events that we're seeing, that Asian man who was smacked against the sidewalk and died, that they claimed that the killer said nothing about Asian. No Asian epithet, no go back to China, none of that. Silence. So he won't categorize that as a hate crime against Asians. That has got to be changed so that these crimes are fully investigated. So we need political power, and that, despite our great diversity, we've got to work in concert as one, as Asian Americans, together with allies, and that's the other important thing. I've been active in the civil rights movement, in the peace movement during the Vietnam War, in LGBT equality movements. So we build allies so that when events like this swell up, then we have political strength. I can't emphasize that. We know the diversity, and we know the within the Asian American community, the history that we share. You know, Japan occupied Korea, and the horrible things that was done by Japanese imperialism in China, Nanking, and Southeast Asia. So we should be mindful of that, but not let that keep us from working in concert.
Well, speaking of women,
sorry,
the
I actually
AAP...
have a reader quote, if we can insert that in there. Oh, no, I have a quote from a reader that we can talk about. This quote is from Jason. He talks about how he was about to drop off his packages, and somebody said, "Get out of my country, you racial slur." And this happened in San Francisco. So that's California too, because the question was about California. And I think one of the things that we can speak to here at the LA Times, and I'm also a native Californian, is this sort of specific feeling, this specific horrific feeling we have of being in this place that has so many vibrant Asian American communities. We have such great Asian American culture here that really sometimes a lot of non-Asians don't really know about, because sometimes we don't invite you guys. And like California is like the home of so many of the biggest diasporas of various Asian countries around the world. We have like the biggest Vietnamese diaspora. We have the biggest Taiwanese diaspora. I could like list it down and down. So it's like different to kind of hear these stories about how, when you talk about like the racism you face, and it's like, oh yeah, I grew up in a country, I was the only Asian person and I got bullied, right? Like that's definitely a super legitimate story. But I think when we're in California, like that's not our story. And I think, and I was thinking about this with my friend and chatting with my friend, and even in California, like what he was saying is, in the end, like we don't know what we don't know. And even in California, like when was the last time there was like a huge mainstream conversation about what it means to be Asian American? Like this is something that we as Asian Americans talk about all the time. So we all know this, and you guys all know this. But he was thinking about it, and he thought it was 1992, the LA uprising. And then I was like, well, what about like 9/11? And he was like, well, I mean, that was definitely a Muslim thing. And then like South Asians were tied into it, right? Because it's just anyone who looked brown or brown Asian or whatever. But like, really, like, in a mainstream way, this only happens when something bad happens to us, and when people die. That's when everybody starts talking about us. And then as journalists and people that are supposed to be telling these like fully human stories, so everybody can realize that we're not perpetual foreigners, that we belong here and we've been here forever, our history has been here forever. Like it like makes us unable to tell these stories if like the only time that we're able to tell these stories for the mainstream is if we're victims and we're hurt, and then we go in and we talk about how like this person was assaulted, and then we can't follow that story all the way through, or who knows, I don't know exactly what happens, but it's just all of this ties together, and why like people don't see us as human, and they can look at the Asian American women being killed and just have a headline about like what the perpetrators objective was.
Yeah, I just wanted to call out George's mention of women. That Stop AAPI Hate report found that 2/3 of targets of this hate were women. And of course, the horrible massacre in Atlanta. I know that we have gotten some reader comments that speak to that. Ada, do you want to share one or two of them regarding the sexualization of women?
Yes. Okay, so here is a quote from Julie, where she basically, it's long and you can read the whole thing later, but she basically says, if it would be too long of a list to tell you how often she's been tokenized, objectified, fetishized, and sexualized. And one of the examples she gives is, a man coming up to her and saying, damn, I could really go for some Chinese takeout right now. And that is, these kind of things for Asian American women, it's like, people always insist it's a compliment. Like we should be flattered by this because, whatever. But the second one is from Kat. And she says, as a teen, I was in a strip mall a lot when a group of white men yelled, how much? I was just 16.
So what do we do about this? That we have to search for solutions. That view of Asian women has been created by the history of media depiction of Asian women as sexual creatures. So we've got to counter that with the reality and create full-fledged, in-depth Asian women stories and sell them to movies and television series and start changing this perception of us, not just complain about we're depicted this way and that way, and isn't that terrible? We now have to step and do it ourselves because we know the best stories and how to humanize those stories. So, I've been urging people to write. I mean, there's a wonderful autobiography in every Asian person's life. That would be fascinating if they could tell that story. And novelists to write stories about the Asian community and depict the characters as fully and richly engaging and interesting as they can make it, not just as sexual creatures or obsequious servants or whatever the stereotype that exists.
Well, another huge stereotype of Asian Americans is the model minority. And despite all of this anti-Asian hate, a lot of people think Asians don't have problems, that we're successful, we're highly educated, we have good jobs, make a lot of money. And Anne, I'd like to ask you, what do people need to know about the challenges and vulnerabilities faced by Asian Americans that are not widely known?
Well, I've been reporting with the help of my colleagues on this whole movement to sustain the activism that we're seeing from Asian Americans. And young people are realizing that their communities share many of the same struggles as Blacks and Latinos, and they can use those activist movements as models to create this powerful sort of movement of their own. And even though Asian activism has claimed some small victories through the years, it's been episodic and struggling to gain some sort of critical mass. And in talking to people from different Asian cultural groups, we see that a new generation is fighting to blow up this model minority myth and condemn the racism that we're all experiencing, to create that same sustained movement to end more than a century and a half of marginalization. They've been energized by BLM, and what happened in Atlanta with 6 Asian victims hardened their resolve, and there's no looking back.
I feel like
oh, sorry, can I speak to that a little bit?
Well, I was actually going to bring you in, Ada, and ask you about this other model minority myth about all Asians are not only economic competitors, but educational competitors, and this idea that Asians are, kind of the elephant in the room when we're talking about elite education and so forth. I think we actually have a few reader comments that speak to that, if you want to share that, and then also, just jump in with what else you're seeing and thinking and feeling.
Yeah, so I think this reader quote is from Jennifer. And it's basically where are you from? No, where are you really from, right? And I think we definitely got a lot of other quotes that were about just people being really annoyed about Asians in their schools and Asians getting all the awards and that's the model minority myth, right? It's sort of like, yeah, like the UCs are full of like a ton of Asians, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, like Harvard, it's so hard to get in there if you're Asian or because like there's just so much competition. And that's the model minority myth. And the thing with the model minority myth is like, it's like a myth that's used to like push down Black and Latino communities by telling that, saying like, look, the Asians can do it, why can't you do it too? And then kind of making it like it's a level playing field and that, everybody is the same and Asians can do it, so everybody can do it too. And I think the important thing to be said about that is that we know it's a myth because we know the community, but it's hard to explain to other people if you don't have the data, right? Sometimes like people need to see the data, and the biggest thing or not the biggest thing, there's a lot of big things, but one of the big things in Asian American activism right now is about disaggregating the data. Sort of like, and that sort of speaks to what we were talking about before, right? Like there's so many different ethnicities, there's so many issues, and there's so many different needs, right? So it doesn't make any sense for like, you know, like if some like Chinese and Taiwanese people are really worried about like just, you know, affirmative action in Harvard, for that to be the same metric of success for somebody who's like Cambodian, where like the educational level is like entirely different. And I think what the push to that is that what happens with Asian Americans is that if you don't disaggregate the data, the crazy rich Asians that you all like to consume, I love the movie and it's great, but it's like those are the model minorities that push our numbers higher to make it seem like our numbers are the same as white numbers. And what happens with that is that basically kind of kill it's the other communities that suffer. I'll give you a quick example, because like where I'm at the utility team, we're doing stories about vaccine distribution, right? And if you look at the numbers, it looks like the marginalized communities are Black and Latino communities, right? And it looks like the Asian numbers are similar to the white numbers, right? But the reason for that is because you're looking at the Arcadia folks, you're looking at the Irvine folks, you're looking at the rich folks, bringing those number ups. And then what happened? But like, if you don't see certain parts of Asian America as like underserved communities, you're missing the folks in Chinatown, the low income folks in Chinatown that don't have transportation, that don't have language barriers. You're missing the Cambodian American community. You're missing all these things. And what happens when we don't disaggregate the data and we don't understand, like the Asian Americans have like the biggest wealth gap. So what happens when we think Asian Americans are doing well is that these, you know, like there's been these charts, right? The AAPI data, I think it's called, where you see kind of like the levels. The Taiwanese, which is me, is like up there in terms of like the educational levels, and they see kind of it go from that. It's the bottom ones that suffer when we don't do that. So I think that's, if you get the data, you'll understand the model minority thing is a myth.
Well, I think one of our reporters did a great story about how Pacific Islanders are disproportionately suffering from COVID-19. And
sure,
I think that really underscored that even if the Asian numbers generally don't look like the numbers are that high, if you do disaggregate and take a closer look, you can see that there are certainly communities within the AAPI umbrella.
Yeah, with the Latino community, because they're like, you know, they're the nurses or the healthcare workers. I have a reporter friend, Agnes Constante, who's she's doing a whole thing of that, and it's so hard. It's so hard to find that data, right? Sorry, go ahead.
I can't emphasize enough urging people, particularly young people, to start defining our image. We tell our stories. We need writers. We need musicians. We need people running for political office, and we have a good number in office now. But we need to start doing it rather than depending on others to do it for us. We know the problem. And the problem is we need to humanize the general public perception of us. And we create the characters that get compassion and understanding. We educate the people of America, because there are fellow citizens and they lack knowledge. And we tell the stories from our experience. We act affirmatively, taking the initiative, rather than just saying we are woe is us, we've got this problem and that problem, and we need to have somebody solve the problem. We need to do it.
Well, along those lines of what can we do to fight this hate, George, you are known as the king of the internet, and you're #1 Facebook influencer with millions of followers. I'm wondering, you know, and you're also known to use humor to open people up. So I'm wondering, although this is definitely not a humorous issue, is there a way to use social media to, you know, open people up and even transform biases?
My view of social media is rapidly changing. I was enamored of it around the turn of the century. I thought it was a fascinating way to. At that time, Star Trek fans were writing me letters, and I think I have a responsibility to respond to them. So I started blogging and a monthly column where I shared stories about what I've been doing that might be of interest to Star Trek fans. But when we started developing the musical on the internment of Japanese Americans, Allegiance, we needed to build an audience for it, an audience that knew something about the internment. So I decided to use social media and to build an audience for it. But at the same time, I saw such ignorance in terms of the LGBT issue. There was a school board man in Little Rock, Arkansas, a man named Clint McCants, who was uh, uh, Instagramming. He wants gays to give each other AIDS so they'll die off. He is on the board of education of that city. I mean, someone like that does not belong in that position. And so I humiliated him by using a word that may not be used on television. But I humiliated him, and he resigned, and he's disappeared. In Tennessee, from East Tennessee, they had a state senator who wanted to ban teachers from using the word gay in their classrooms. They're the people that need to help young people who are making discoveries about themselves. And if the word gay is banned, and therefore the connotation that that's something bad, it's being destructive to the effort to equalize, get equality for LGBT people. So I said, I tweeted, all right, if you're going to ban the word gay, then my surname rhymes with gay, Takei, gay. So the teachers can use my name, my surname, instead of gay. And you can march in a Takei pride parade or at Christmas time sing, Don we now our Takei apparel, fa la 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 la. And that spread like wildfire. And that man was became the butt of all jokes, and he lost an election. So, it's a powerful medium for positive effect. But now we're discovering that it can be a fierce, vicious destroyer of truth and good things. And so I am, and the forces are way beyond any individual's capabilities. When nations, Russia, can hack the system and cause all sorts of chaos. So I'm not that big on social media anymore, although I still try to keep using it as a positive force.
But I think that you can easily give a master class on how to use Twitter as a daily effective platform. You have quite a way with words there, George.
Well, thank you very much. Those are tools, and it can be a powerful. I mean, I'll use a word. I called Clint McCants a douchebag. That was a bullet that humiliated him and got him off the Board of Education. It's knowing how to use words as weapons.
Well, let's talk about other tools that people can use against this hate. I know that mental health services, they're not really something that a lot of Asian Americans seek out. There may be some taboos on therapy. And I'd like to start with you and ask, what are you hearing and seeing in terms of how people are easing their pain, their anxiety, their fear over this?
Well, there are so many services that are available right now, free therapy for families and individuals who are suffering. And I've also been really impressed by how in our own industry, people are stepping up to offer like mental health webinars and live chats for journalists. You know, the trauma that we have witnessed in our coverage from the start of the pandemic and the way that it has stretched beyond our expectation. I have been very grateful for the resources, and now there's a huge fund that has collected hundreds of thousands of dollars to provide services for journalists that can't easily access it. I think ADA has also been looking into the mental health element.
Yeah, actually, like for the utilities team, we've been doing a lot of mental health stories at the LA Times, which honestly, during the pandemic it's been so good to just be talking to therapists all day. And it's true, like, you know, I admire them so much. They're really stepping up. And I mean, if you talk to any therapist right now, they're booked solid. And I mean, it's like we're looking at like a public health crisis coming up, you know, like it's like this like mental health is a stigma, but it's a thing that's how could it not affect everybody right now? So I think it's kind of like, it is a stigma in the Asian American community. And so I think there's some statistics where like Asian Americans, like we kind of, I forgot the phrasing of it. Like we have a higher rate of sort of like psychiatric disorders, but we're like 3 times less likely than white people to seek treatment for it. So, I mean, I think part of it is just sort of acknowledging when we don't feel good, you know, acknowledging it's a problem. Like the first step is just like acknowledging it, right? Acknowledging like, you know, like I had a really bad week. You know what I mean? I think a lot of us had a bad week. I mean, I was sort of thinking about like at first in the very beginning, how did you react? Like I was like paralyzed for part of it, right? But I think so when I've been talking to like therapists, just super simple. It's like try to figure out what your triggers are. Like what do you act like? Like what are the physical signs that happen when you know, start feeling bad? For me, it's like, you know, I start like pacing. I don't know what I'm doing, and you know, or maybe you can't sleep, or something like that. So figure that out for you. Or I start yelling at my husband, right? but then the other part is like you really need to really intentionally schedule time for joy, because that's like such an important part of it too. And we, especially like during the pandemic, we're all working hard. We have families at home. It's hard to take that time to schedule it, but that's so important because that's what's going to sustain you. So, I mean, for me, it's like my kids, right? Like I have 2 young girls, and it's like, as crazy as it is, it's like, you know, being able to take care of them. And like, that's what brings me joy. And that's just like a really, really super quick thing. But I mean, if you get those 2, that's a good step.
Well, at the end of the day, I feel like this is not going to be won, this battle, without strong allies. And George, you have been a civil rights activist your entire life, and you have been involved in some really significant wins. The victory for Japanese American redress and reparations, as well as marriage equality. What does it take to wage a successful social justice campaign?
I think I was blessed in the father I had, because when I became curious about our internment and started asking challenging questions to my father, and so this was when I was in high school, he said, he told me about our form of government. He said, it's democracy. It's a people's democracy. And the people have to take responsibility for our government. We have noble ideals, rule of law, equal justice under the law, the pillar of our justice system being due process. All that disappeared for us. As noble as those words may seem, they're just words up there on carved in marble or printed on paper in black and white. They're inert. It's the people and what we do to infuse those words with validity and truth and meaning. And that can only be done by people who know the meaning of those words and care enough to actively participate in the process. It's called a participatory democracy. And I kept saying, yeah, but look, they imprisoned us. I mean, there's nothing you can do. The government's too powerful. He said, we are the government. He said, I couldn't become a naturalized citizen because I was born in Japan. But because of the heroism of the 442nd men in 1952, they gave immigrants from Asia the right to become naturalized. And I remember seeing him studying way into the night. He had worked a hard, long day, and yet he spent more hours at the dining room table going over those books. And I said, why do you do that when the government treated you so badly? He said, because I want to participate, and you should too. And he took me downtown to the Adlai Stevenson for President campaign headquarters and introduced me to electoral politics. And I was a gregarious kid, and it was a lot of fun. But at the same time, I got to understand how this system works. It's these people that passionately care and are volunteering their times. They're all busy people, or there were students who were gathering there. And I got to meet Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a supporter of Stevenson, and she came to visit the headquarters to thank us. My father was there too when the whisper was going on. She's coming. She's coming. My father excused himself. He wasn't there when Eleanor Roosevelt came by, but it was a thrill for me. And when we all lined up when she entered the headquarters, and she went down the row, thanking each of us. And she shook my hand and said, "Thank you, George, for what you're doing for Adlai." She called me George. I was blown away by that. How did she know my name? And then I realized I had a tag on me.
Just the name tag. Yeah.
But my father he knew she was a good woman, but she was Mrs. Roosevelt, and it was too uncomfortable for him to shake her hand. So I think it's all our responsibility, particularly as journalists, for you folks. You have access to a lot of people, thinking people, and to share with them our story and encourage our people, Asian Americans, to actively participate in the process. We have about a half a dozen Asian American congresspeople in Congress now. We have Senator Mazie Hirono in the Senate. And on the local level, we have many Asian Americans running for city councils or running for mayors. So, that's the way to deal with the issues that we've been talking about.
And Anne, you earlier had spoke about this uprising of activists. I know that you're covering a story about the activism that's going on right now. And I know that the elder generation has always been much more reticent about standing up and speaking out. I'm wondering if you see a cultural or some generational shift going on in terms of a greater willingness to speak out.
Well, I think the images are so powerful, and the more that they see elderly coming out of their, monolingual shell to fight against what's going on, they are sparked into action. The elderly lady in San Francisco who fought off the attacker with her cane, and then her GoFundMe fundraiser that raised, hundreds of thousands of dollars that she wants to donate back to community groups. I know that story has been translated into multiple Asian languages, and seniors that I've talked to at a Senior Citizen Center, they told me that that's all that they've been thinking about. They said, you know, this woman, look at her eyes, her body's suffering, she's weakening, and she's not giving up. So we cannot stay silent because we would not be true to supporting our fellow elderly. I've been very, very inspired by what I've seen of the older generation. And George had spoken of access. As journalists, we have a lot of access, but we want more. We want our audience, our readers of the LA Times to engage with us on a deeper level, to allow us to dig more below the surface of what is going on in these communities and hear more about the untold stories.
And Ada, there's been an outpouring of people who are not Asian Americans who are outraged by what's happening, who want to step forward, who want to know what they can do to support the campaign against hate. And you recently edited a story on how to be an ally against racism. Can you share some of those tips?
Yeah, so I edited a story by Jessica Roy on the utility team, my partner in crime. And doing this story for us is being a good ally. But I remember sort of like, you know, I think it was on Wednesday or I don't know what day it was. But I saw Greg Pak post on Twitter like this thing that was like bystander intervention training to stop anti-Asian American and xenophobic harassment. And it's actually like these two-part trainings that you can sign up right now and take. There's trainings that are happening in the future, but I'm going to try to do it really quickly because I didn't know. Because I think sometimes, and this is the whole thing of utility journalism and news that you can use, which is that sometimes you're just, especially this year, it's just everything's terrible, and you're just like, what can I do? What can I do to not feel helpless? And this is kind of one of those things where it's like, if you see something happening, like, what can you do to help? And so this stuff that Jessica like reported for us comes from Hollaback Care California and Stop AAPI Hate. And this is stuff that I didn't even realize. But so if you see somebody being harassed or something like that, the main thing that I think people get wrong is that they're scared because they don't want to confront them, right? Because they're scared of their safety, right? But what they explain to us is that it's not about being like a superhero trying to rescue someone. Because actually, if you confront them, like sometimes it actually backfires. So what they say you need to think of it as is what you're doing is creating a safe space for the target so you can give them an option to leave the situation. So what they recommend, they call it the 5 Ds. I'll try to do this fast. Distract. So it's like you come up to them, and it's even like you can just start a conversation like, hey, do I know you? Like, oh, do you know where this train goes? Like, and it's basically just to distract. It's just like create a way out, right? Or you're like, hey, it's nice to see you, even though, you know, that kind of thing. So distract. 2, delegate. Like you can try to find a person in a position of authority, like the store manager or something like that, if you can, you know, somebody there. 3, document. See, this one is like good for me to know, because sometimes it's like, so I'm walking around with my 2 kids, and to be honest, like I'm not confronting anybody when I have my young daughters with me. But it's like good to know that, like, even if you can't go up to them, if you can document it, like through video and photo, and in California, you have the legal right to take photos and video when you're in public. So, but the thing is that you need to keep in mind that if the attacker sees you escalating, the situation, or if the attacker sees you documenting, it might escalate the situation. So if you want to document, you have to try to do this in a very like unobtrusive way.
Yeah, I think that we're running out of time. Ada, can you post that story in our chat box for our audience? That would be very valuable. I apologize that our host tonight, Teresa, has lost her internet connection. And I want to really thank you, our audience, for staying with us through the late hour. You know, we want to wrap up with just 1 or 2 sentences from first George and then Ada.
Well, I'm grateful for what all you journalists are doing. You are the people that enlighten and inform the readership, and we can all play a part in making our country and our community a much better place. Thank you very much for this opportunity and all that you're doing.
Thank you, George, for adding your voice to the quieter voices that we're all trying to amplify. What about you, Ada?
Thank you to Anne for doing all this work and being on the ground. I don't think people realize how much you do, and we really appreciate it. But really quickly, like, we have a survey, like if you're watching this live, that you can fill out. And then I guess, you know, if you're not watching this live, maybe we can share it on Twitter. And it's not just about the panel and what it is, but what we talked about, how important collecting data is, how important desegregating data is, and what George and Anne said too. Like, as journalists, we're the people who can do these stories, make you guys feel fully human, not a perpetual foreigner. You know, like, we can do these stories, but we need your help. Like, we want to interact with you guys and understand what is important to you. Like, it's, and like what you would like to see us cover more of. And it's not that we can do every single story that you suggest to us, but I just think it's so important for us to collect this information and understand who our audiences are. And that's what the survey can do. So if you guys would take the time to fill it out for us, it would help us.
How will they access that survey?
I'm not sure if it pops up if you're watching the live stream, but if not, then go to our Twitter. Go to our Twitter. We'll share it there.
Can you tweet out that survey as well as Jessica Roy's stories, which I think will be really helpful? Speaking for myself, I think journalism takes a village. And I really want to thank you, our producers, for their teamwork tonight. And my deep gratitude also goes to my editors, current and past, Shelby, Hector, Cindy, Reed, and our unsung heroes, the copy editors, photographers, page designers, all of my colleagues. We are learning through this coverage. We're not masters of it. We learn from you, and we're working in service of the story. So I hope that you will stay with us, support the storytelling by subscribing to the LA Times, and call us out, advise us, open yourselves up to us. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we hope to be with you again.
Let me really quickly give you a shout out, Anne, because we have like a story gallery on the LA Times. I guess you could search for it. That kind of outlines all the different stories that we've done the entire year. It starts with Albert's video. I mean, it starts with something more of it. But then if you go on our website, you'll see that there's actually a lot of coverage, like from the, you know, vandalism and like Little Tokyo, like all this thing. And you can see a timeline of all of this and see all the great work that Anne has done, our colleague Andrew Campa has done, Hannah Fry did something for us in OC. There's so much stuff, and I encourage you guys to go to the website.
Yeah.
And I'd like to thank you also for one important thing that the LA Times has done, and the Asian American journalist there has done. It's that story on the camp called Tule Lake. That is symbolically the most important. It was the biggest and most bristly with militarism at that camp, Tule Lake. And you did a very, very fine story on that. Most Japanese Americans don't know about Tule Lake either. And so that was an important contribution to the discussion. Thank you very much.
That story ran over the weekend, covered by some of my outstanding colleagues. And as you can see, we bring the, you know, sheer teamwork of the LA Times, the largest media organization in the state and in the West. So thank you again for staying with us, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.